Okay, part 2 of my review of this knife. Like I was saying, this thing is really built like a tank in the way that it's oversized, so that I feel like and because it's oversized, and for normal hands, a very thin blade is hard to hold, but then the thickness of the handle actually makes it really, really good for a very good grip. I mean, this is probably the best grip I've ever felt in any knife, fixed blade or pocket knife, in my life. So, good job, Emerson, on that. And for precise cuts, and there's no jimping. I mean, there is some jimping here. You see, but it's cut in a way, and also because of that coating, that it almost gives no real grip. But then again, this deep choil here for the index finger eliminates really the need for any jimping, I feel like, because your hand is never going to go forward because your index finger is locked in here. And I really like knives that have this design here for the index finger, because and also the Skyline, the Kershaw Skyline has this design as well, because it just gives you such a good grip on the knife, whereas like on knives without that design, like this OBD1, and no jimping, your hands can easily slip forward, and you do not want that when using this knife, when using a knife in general, I mevel. So that's a really good feature. Let's talk about the blade next. It's a conventionally beveled design, as you can see. It's not a V-grind. You can see here, both sides, both secondary bevels are cut. So it's not a V-grind. But all Emersons, every knife that Emerson makes, whether it's chisel ground or V-ground, has a single sided main bevel, which is like the cutting edge. As you can see here, one side is ground, but the other side is not. This side is merely squared away. It's a zero bevel. Oh, almost cut my hand there. Whew, gotta be careful. It's a zero bevel on this side, and it's actually only ground on this side. So even if on the Emerson website you see that a knife is a V ground, it's not actually V ground. It just means that the secondary bevel is V ground, but the main cutting edge on any Emerson is one-sided, is grinded on one side only, kind of like a chisel grind, which is kind of a plus and a minus, because on a conventionally ground knife, if you have 15 degrees on one edge, if you have a 15-degree edge, it's 30 degrees inclusive. But then on a single beveled blade like this, if you have a 15-degree edge and the other side is a 0-degree bevel, you have a 15-degree inclusive, which makes it a lot steeper than a 30-degree. And because of that, this knife is a great cutter. It's a great slicer, and there's almost no drag on the blade, I feel like, when you're cutting through things. But I don't know how well it'll hold up to hard use because it has such a steep edge, but hey, I think it should be okay, just because the blade is so thick. And and people will think chisel cut. A chisel grind also aids in the strength of the blade, but then again, this one's not chisel ground, it's V ground on the secondary edge. The bad side about having a single-sided grind is that when you're trying to cut things, with a conventionally ground knife, you just cut down if you want to make a straight cut. But then with this kind of grind, you kind of have to angle the knife so that the cutting edge is perpendicular to what you're trying to cut. But since this is made to be kind of like a tactical knife, I don't think that really matters. So, because it'll cut a person no matter what angle it's at. The blade is 154 cm, made by, I think 154 cm is made by Crucible, but I'm not too sure about that. I consider the steel pretty good, but I consider it a little bit dated because there's better steels out there now, like S30V and maybe even D2, and the blade is about 1/8 of an inch thick, if you can see here, which is very thick. And here begins my criticism. In my opinion, let's just put the knife down for a second while I talk. In my opinion, what's the point of having such a thick blade in a pocket knife? A thick blade is nice in a fixed blade because it gives you blade strength when you're torsioning the blade side to side. When I used my Rat 3 to split a small log the other day, I cranked the blade from side to side to get the log apart. But in a pocket knife, first of all, the locking mechanism, liner lock in this case, would fail way before any real stress is put on the blade itself. I can almost promise you that you can't get a pocket knife blade to fail before the liner locking system does, or whatever system it has. And you know, the liner lock will probably just slip off the knife anyways before any stress is put on it. So I ask you, Emerson, why such a thick blade? I think they just do it to look good, to look cool, and just so, you know, for marketing reasons. They can say like, oh, look how thick our knives are. But and that works for most people, but for people that have that, you know, for people that where knives are a hobby and they really understand some of the intricacies behind folding knives, doesn't really work for me. So take it for whatever you will. And that's my and you know, the thick blade also causes another problem, which is my #1 criticism of this knife. When you have a very thick and long blade, look to Strider knives, you absolutely need a frame lock. Now, you know, a frame lock, people use it as a kind of magical term, but a frame lock is not a, you know, it's not a magical system that solves all the problems of having a folding knife. It's basically a liner lock that's so thick that you can't fit a scale over it. So imagine if there was no scale and this whole thing, this liner and here, was just one big locking liner. So that's basically what a frame lock is. I believe that the liner or frame that locks up a folding knife should be proportional to the thickness of the blade itself. And in most cases it's true because, you know, the liner is thin, but so is the blade. The problem with the Horseman, gosh, I keep opening and closing and opening the blade because, you know, it feels so nice opening this knife. Anyways, the problem with the Horseman is that the blade is very thick, and the liner, which I assume is titanium, which, you know, it's nice because titanium can be made thicker than steel at the same weight, and also titanium is very stiff, so that's a very good material for making a liner. The liner itself is not very thick in proportion to the blade. It's only about half the thickness. Basically, the blade dwarfs the liner lock in comparison. See, the liner lock on this knife is not as thick or as rigid as on the OBD1. If you take a look here, see that? Which is pretty sad because the OBD1 has a tiny blade in comparison to the Horseman. So, and when I first got this knife from yourcornerstore.com, I realized very soon that there was a lot of vertical, so it's up and down, had a tremendous vertical play to it, which, you know, made me very sad because, you know, this knife MSRP is for $200, and it's also got a reputation for being the most hardware knives, you know, #1 hard use knife, you know. So I sent it back and received a brand new knife, which I assume they hand-picked because they didn't want me to complain again, and I appreciate that. However, the new knife's blade stop, this thing right here, rattled. It didn't sit perfectly nested in the liners, so it would rattle when you know, did this with the knife. But then I guess, you know, it's not too big of a problem because I just put a little of something in the liners that pushed it to the other side so that it doesn't rattle anymore. But again, it's kind of disappointing in such an expensive knife. Now, I don't know how most people test their blade for, oh, actually, we're coming up on 10 minutes, so we're going to have to go to a part 3.